Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine.
And painful situation on the front lines.
1 year, 2 years since the Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his troops to invade Ukraine.
Russia's war in Ukraine has entered its third year. What many thought on February 24, 2022 would be a swift Russian military operation against its smaller neighbour has turned out to be the largest land war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. This is no longer about Russia and Ukraine. This is now a proxy conflict between Russia and NATO, a transatlantic nuclear alliance. 2 years since the war began, where does it stand today and how it is transforming Russia and the world? Hello everyone, welcome to The Hindu. This is Stanley Johnny, The Hindu's International Affairs editor. If one looks back at the beginning of the war, it's not difficult to see that President Vladimir Putin made a grave strategic miscalculation when he ordered the invasion of Europe's second largest country with less than 200,000 troops. Mr. Putin probably expected a quick victory like he did in Georgia in 2008 or Crimea in 2014, but that did not happen. In 2022, Russians were forced to retreat from Kharkiv and Kherson in Ukraine. The West doubled down on its military aid and economic support for Kyiv. Russia had declared demilitarisation and denazification of Ukraine as its objectives. Ukraine, on the other side, wanted to push back the invading troops and recapture the lost territories, including Crimea. The West wanted to use Ukrainian forces to bleed out the Russian troops and weaken Russia as a great power. The wheels of the war were grinding on. Who is meeting their objectives today? Ukraine last year launched an ambitious counteroffensive with advanced weapons from the West. Their plan was to make swift advances into Russia's line of defense in the south and destroy Mr. Putin's land bridge that connects the Donbass with Crimea. 8 months after the counteroffensive began, it's now evident that the campaign has failed. General Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's former commander-in-chief, who was fired by President Zelensky, had called for a mass mobilization, suggesting that Ukraine was facing an acute shortage of fighters on the front line. They lost many of their West-supplied weapons in the counteroffensive and are waiting for fresh supplies. Ukraine is almost entirely dependent on the West for critical supplies, but aid from the United States, the single largest supporter of Ukraine, is stuck in Congress amid growing Republican opposition. On the other side, the Russians are on the offensive. In December, Russia claimed its first victory since the capture of Bakhmut in May when it seized Mariinka. Earlier this month, Ukraine was forced to abandon Avdiivka, a strategically important town in Donetsk. Russians are now advancing westward in Donetsk and piling up pressure on Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv, Kherson in the south. The message from the battlefield is alarming for Ukraine and its partners in the West. Take a look at the West's strategy. The West, or NATO to be specific, had taken a twofold approach towards Ukraine. One was to provide economic and military assistance to Kyiv to keep the fight against Russia going on. And the second leg was to weaken Russia's economy and war machine through sanctions. With Ukraine's failed counteroffensive and a changing political climate in Washington, D.C., with the prospect of a second Trump presidency looming, the first pillar of this policy faces uncertainty, if not absolute peril. The second pillar, which are the sanctions, has hurt Russia badly, no doubt about it. Western officials believe that sanctions have deprived Russia of over $430 billion in revenue it would otherwise have gained since the war began. Europe has also curtailed its energy purchases from Russia. Sanctions have also made it difficult for Moscow to acquire critical technologies, including microchips, which are necessary for its defense industry. But this is not the whole story. Russia has found several ways to work around sanctions and keep its economy going. When Europe cut energy sales, Russia offered discounted crude oil to big growing economies such as China, India and Brazil. It amassed a ghost fleet of ships to keep sending oil to its new markets without relying on Western shipping companies and insurers. It set up shell companies and private corporations operating in its neighborhood, say Armenia or Turkey, to import dual-use technologies which were re-exported to Russia to be used in defense production. China, the world's second largest economy, ramped up its financial and trade ties with Russia, including the export of dual-use technologies. Russia moved away from the dollar to other currencies, mainly the Chinese yuan, for trade and boosted defense and public spending at home. Its defense budget went up by nearly 70% this year. Does it mean that everything is going well for Mr. Putin? No, it doesn't. Since the war began, two countries in its neighborhood, Sweden and Finland, have joined NATO, expanding the alliance's border with Russia. Now, if you look at the Baltic Sea, all basin countries except Russia are NATO members, which makes it practically look like a NATO lake. Mr. Putin spent years after coming to power to build strong economic ties with Europe, which are now in tatters. Russia's hold on its immediate neighborhood is also loosening, which was evident in tensions with Armenia and the latest decision to freeze participation in the Moscow-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. Russia is also increasingly becoming dependent on China, even though the Kremlin is careful not to upset the sensitivity of New Delhi. India enters the picture here. How does India look at the war? India's ties with Russia have multi-dimensions. While the energy aspect of this partnership, which flourished after the war, is seen largely opportunistic, the defense side is structural. India also sees Russia, a Eurasian powerhouse, as an important long-term strategic partner in tackling its continental challenges. But the elephant in the room was China. Russia's deepening ties with China triggered different narratives on India's choices. One section argued that the growing synergy between Russia and China should serve as a wake-up call for New Delhi to revisit its Russian policy. Others argued that India would be wary of pushing Russia deeper into China's embrace by towing the anti-Russian Western line. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar explained India's thinking on this matter at the Raisina dialogue recently. The world must give Russia more options rather than closing doors on it and pushing it towards a closer embrace with China, Mr. Jaishankar said. The minister's comments underscored India's concerns about a deepening China-Russia partnership, but his policy prescriptions were much more nuanced. What has happened today with Russia is essentially a lot of doors have been shut to Russia in the West. He said, "We know the reasons why Russia is turning to parts of the world which are not West. Now I think it makes sense to give Russia multiple options," said Mr. Jaishankar. Meaning, India's ties with Russia are here to stay and expand, irrespective of what its Western partners think of Moscow. For more such videos, subscribe to The Hindu. Thank you.